The courtroom was quiet in a way that felt almost wrong. July 30th, 2012. Manhattan Federal Court. The woman at the defendant's table was 50 years old. Her name was Pettway, and, to people who knew her, and on this morning, under the weight of every eye in that room, she stood and opened her mouth. "I would like to apologize to the family," she said. Her voice didn't crack. It was measured, controlled, almost rehearsed. "It may be rejected, but I am deeply sorry for what I've done. If they don't accept it, it's understandable. I'm here to right my wrong." From across the room, a man named Carl Tyson leaned forward in his seat. He had waited 25 years for this moment. 25 years of birthdays he wasn't there for. School plays he never saw. A daughter's first steps he never witnessed. A face he could only imagine every time he closed his eyes. When reporters caught him outside the courthouse, he didn't mince words. "I'm not really satisfied with the sentence," he said. "I figure Pettway should have received 23 years in jail, because it took 23 years from me." He paused. Then he said something that landed like a stone in still water. "I wasn't able to take my daughter to school, take my daughter to daycare, watch my daughter get on the bus, have birthday parties with my daughter. For 23 years, and you had me suffering. You took something away from me. You hurt me so bad." The judge that day, the Honorable P. Kevin Castell, sentenced Pettway to 12 years in federal prison. He said it plainly. This was not a crime of greed, not a crime of vengeance. It was a crime of selfishness, he said. A crime that inflicted a parent's worst nightmare on a couple. He wasn't wrong. But none of that explains how we got here. Before we go any further, drop a comment right now and let us know where you're watching from. We are a global community, and we genuinely love to hear from you. If you're new here and stories like this matter to you, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell so you never miss what we bring to you, and share this with someone who needs to see it. This story is unlike anything you've heard before. Stay with us. Let's go back past the courtroom, past the headlines, past the DNA test results, past the tearful reunion at LaGuardia Airport. Let's go all the way back to a summer that felt ordinary, to a neighborhood where life was just beginning. New York City, July 15th, 1987. Harlem was alive that summer, loud and warm and full of the kind of ordinary miracles that neighborhoods carry without knowing it. Joy White was 16 years old. 16. Still a child herself in so many ways, still learning what the world expected of her. But on that Tuesday in July, she became a mother, and the world felt, for just a moment, like it had given her something precious. She named her daughter Carlina Renee White. Joy would later describe those first 19 days as the most tender of her life. Bathing her baby, putting tiny bows in her hair, marveling at how small she was, how warm, how absolutely real. Carl Tyson, 22, an auto parts salesman, full of plans and pride, would visit and hold his daughter and feel something shift inside him, the way it does when a man becomes a father for the first time. They were young. They were not wealthy, but they were a family, and Carlina was theirs. Then August came. On August 4th, 1987, 19 days after Carlina came into the world, Joy noticed something wrong. Her daughter was burning up. The baby had a temperature of 104 degrees. Panicked, Joy and Carl rushed Carlina to Harlem Hospital Center. Doctors discovered she had an infection. She had swallowed fluid during delivery, and it had festered quietly. She was admitted to the pediatric unit on the 17th floor and placed on 4 antibiotics. They were told she would be fine. A woman approached them as they waited. She was warm, reassuring. She wore white shoes, white stockings, white slacks, and a green smock. She looked exactly like a nurse. She told Joy and Carl that their baby was being well cared for. She told them it was okay to go home and rest. Joy would never see her daughter again. Sometime between 2:30 and 3:55 in the morning, during the shift change, when the ward was at its most vulnerable, the woman returned to the pediatric unit. She walked to the crib where Carlina White lay. She gently removed the 4 from the baby's arm. She wrapped her in something soft, and she walked out of the hospital. The surveillance cameras in Harlem Hospital were not working that night. By the time hospital staff noticed that the bassinet was empty, she was already gone. That was the last confirmed time anyone saw Carlina White, as her parents knew her for 23 years. To understand what was lost that morning, you have to understand who Joy White was, and what it meant for a 16-year-old girl in Harlem to become a mother. Joy was, by all accounts, someone still figuring out the world when the world handed her something monumental. She had not had an easy road, but Carlina was the thing that made the future feel possible. Something to organize herself around. Something worth doing right. In the years that followed the abduction, Joy would work for a financial brokerage, raise other children, and live with a grief that never went anywhere. She still, in 2004, 17 years after her daughter disappeared, used Carlina's name as her email address. That is not something a mother does if she has moved on. That is something a mother does when a piece of her is still, every single day, waiting. Carl Tyson carried it differently. Men often do. He carried it in the way he spoke about her. Not past tense, never past tense, but present. As if she might still walk through a door somewhere. As if the years had not really accumulated in the way they seemed to. Carl and Joy did not survive the loss together. They separated the year after the abduction. What happens to two young people when the thing that bound them is stolen from them? You can imagine. The grief doesn't bring people together the way the movies suggest. Sometimes it just moves through a relationship like water through a crack, widening what was already fragile. They filed a $100 million lawsuit against Harlem Hospital in 1989. The cameras had been offline. The woman in the green smock had been seen loitering on that ward for 3 weeks before the abduction, 3 full weeks, and no one had done enough. In 1993, they received a settlement of $750,000. They put it in a trust fund for Carlina, in case she was ever found before the age of 21. She would be found at 23. A city put up a $10,000 reward. Flyers with Carlina's face went up across the country. The NYPD questioned a woman in Baltimore, someone witnesses had identified as possibly having been in the hospital that night. Nothing came of it. The case ran on the television program Unsolved Mysteries in 1989 as part of a missing baby roll call. The phones rang. None of the leads went anywhere. The case went cold. But Carlina White did not disappear. She just became someone else. The woman who walked out of Harlem Hospital that August morning was named Anya Pettway. She went by Ann. She was somewhere between 25 and 30 years old in 1987. Tall, heavy-set, a slight southern accent. She had grown up in a household she would later describe as violent. Her mother, she told investigators, beat her with belts and extension cords. The childhood had left marks that never fully healed. At 15, she began having miscarriages. Not one, not two, several miscarriages. 2 stillbirths. Each one a loss that compounded the last. Each one carving out a little more of whatever it was inside her that believed she would ever get to be what she wanted so desperately to be. A mother. In 1977, when she was a teenager in Waterbury, Connecticut, she was charged with larceny and spent weeks in jail. It was the first of many run-ins with the law that would pepper her life the way footnotes pepper a text. Persistent, small, always there. Over the years there would be charges of forgery, embezzlement, theft, drug-related offenses. She pleaded guilty to stealing cash and clothing from the Hudson Belk store in Raleigh, North Carolina, where she worked. She was put on probation in Connecticut at least 3 separate times. Friends who knew in Pettway in those years would say she was not a hellraiser, that she wasn't violent, that she was, in her way, a normal enough person on the surface. But beneath that surface, forensic psychiatrists would later explain, there was a need so consuming it had eclipsed everything else. Dr. Stephen Reich, director of the Forensic Psychology Group in New York, would describe it this way. When normal coping mechanisms are absent, only the naked inner need remains, and it must be satisfied at all costs. Dr. Philip Resnick of Case Western Reserve University would add that women who commit this kind of crime are not typically looking to harm the child. They are desperately, pathologically trying to love one. In the mid-1980s, while Joy White was a teenager in Harlem, and Pettway was in the throes of a depression so severe, according to court filings, that she could barely function. She had told people she was pregnant. When she left town for a while and came back with a baby girl, her friends and family simply assumed she had gone somewhere to give birth. Her on-again, off-again boyfriend's surname, Nance, became the child's last name. The child was named Nedra Nance, but her real name was Carlina White. Picture 2 timelines running side by side in the summer of 1987, on a collision course neither party could see. On one side, Joy White, 16 years old, sitting in the waiting area of a hospital, exhausted and frightened, and trusting the woman in the white shoes who told her everything would be okay. Joy, who had put bows in her baby's hair that morning. Joy, who was too young to carry what was about to be placed on her. On the other side, and Pettway, who had spent weeks watching that ward, who had learned the rhythms of the shift changes, who had studied the layout of the pediatric unit, who had comforted those parents that very evening, not out of cruelty, perhaps, but out of something even more unsettling, out of need, out of a certainty that had been building in her for years, through every miscarriage and every empty nursery and every friend who had what she couldn't, that the only way forward was this. Joy went home to rest. The shift changed at 2:30 in the morning, and Pettway walked into the ward where Carlina White lay sleeping, pulled the 4 from the baby's arm as gently as she could, wrapped her up, and carried her out into the dark. She took a train from New York to Bridgeport, Connecticut, 45 miles, less than an hour and a half, a world away, and she began to raise Carlina as her own. In Bridgeport, Carlina White grew up as Nedra Nance. She went by Nettie. She attended Thomas Hooker School. She would go on to graduate from Warren Harding High School in Bridgeport in 2005. By all accounts, she was a bright girl, social, warm, someone who made an impression, and raised her in a Bridgeport home, moved her to Atlanta with a sister at some point, moved her around in the way people who are always keeping something beneath the surface tend to do. In 1998, and gave birth to a biological son, Trayvon Teal, and Carlina grew up believing he was her half-brother, helping babysit him, playing the older sister role. But something was always off. I just felt different my whole life, Carlina would later say. Something didn't feel right. She looked at, and she didn't see herself. The physical traits didn't match. The bone structure was different. The features were different. As a teenager, these things began to accumulate in the back of her mind the way unanswered questions do, quietly, persistently. She asked for her birth certificate, and was evasive. She pressed, and deflected. Then, at around 16, Carlina became pregnant. She needed her documentation to apply for prenatal care. She needed a birth certificate. She went to and with a directness that only someone truly desperate for answers can muster, and eventually admitted that she didn't have a valid birth certificate for her. She had tried, according to investigators, to forge one, but could never make it convincing enough. She told Carlina the lie she had apparently prepared for years, that Carlina had been given up by a drug addict mother, that she had taken her in out of love, that her biological mother had abandoned her. Carlina was shaken, but she sat with it. She absorbed it, and she continued to search in the way that only she could, quietly, from the inside, with the patience of someone who has spent a whole life feeling like a question without an answer. The years passed. She graduated high school. She had her daughter, Samani. She moved with into Atlanta. She lived the life she had been given. But the question never went away. In 2010, Carlina White was 23 years old and living in Atlanta with her 5-year-old daughter. She sat down at a computer. She navigated to the website of the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. She typed in her birth year, 1987, and she started scrolling through the photographs of babies who had gone missing around that time. Then she stopped. There was a photo of a newborn, and next to it, an age-progressed composite, a forensic artist's rendering of what that child might look like at 19. The composite had been created using photographs of Joy White and Joy's other children. The artist had modeled the face on Carlina's biological half-sister. Carlina stared at it. The face in that composite looked like her. But it was more than that. She looked at the infant photo, a tiny baby, 19 days old, and saw the same nose, the same jaw, the same eyes she saw every morning in the mirror. And then she noticed something that locked everything into place. The baby in the photo had a birthmark on her arm. Carlina looked down at her own arm. She had the same birthmark. In the same place. I just felt different my whole life, she had said. Something didn't feel right, and then everything made sense. She called the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children's hotline. She was encouraged and aided, at least in part, by Pettway's own sister, Cassandra Johnson, a detail that speaks volumes. Even in N's own family, there were people who had wondered. The center narrowed the search down to 2 possible cases. They compared baby photos. They looked at the birthmark. They contacted Joy White and Carl Tyson. The NYPD gathered DNA samples. And in January 2011, 23 years, 5 months, and some days after a woman walked out of Harlem Hospital with their daughter, Joy White and Carl Tyson received the call. The DNA was a match. Nedra Nance was Carlina White. The reunion happened at LaGuardia Airport on a Saturday. Carl Tyson, who had spent 23 years trying to fill the shape of a daughter-sized hole in his life, stood at arrivals and watched her walk toward him. "When I saw her," he told reporters, "my heart just dropped. She said to me, 'Dad, don't start crying.' How could I not cry?" At Joy's home, the family gathered for dinner. Children ran around. Carlina's grandmother, Elizabeth White, who was 71 years old and had lived for over 2 decades without knowing what had become of her granddaughter, watched it all. "On Sunday we had a family dinner," she said, "and the kids were running and playing around, and it felt like Carlina had been with us all the time." As soon as Joy told her name, Elizabeth added, "and she found out she was Carlina, she's been going by that ever since." At the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, the digital record that had carried Carlina's face for 23 years was updated. Across the photo of the 19-day-old baby in the Harlem Hospital crib, a single word was stamped in bold letters. Located. This case became the longest child abduction in the center's history to be successfully resolved. It was also the first known case in which the kidnapping victim herself led the reunification efforts. But the story was far from over. And Pettway, once the story became public, did not disappear quietly. She initially went on the run. For a brief period after Carlina's story made the news, she was unreachable. Then, on the morning of January 23, 2011, 2 days after a warrant had been issued for her arrest on a probation violation related to her old embezzlement conviction, she drove from North Carolina to Connecticut. She arranged care for her biological son, and then she walked into the FBI office in Bridgeport and surrendered. She told federal investigators that she kidnapped Carlina White because of the stress over whether she would ever be able to be a parent. She said she was truly sorry. She said she had taken the baby on a train to Bridgeport and told her friends and family that Carlina was her child. The federal grand jury indicted her on February 17, 2011. She did not immediately plead guilty. At her arraignment, when a federal judge asked if she was pleading not guilty to kidnapping, she said, "Yes, sir." It was a surprise. She had already confessed. The plea was later changed on February 10, 2012, when she entered a guilty plea to the federal kidnapping charge. In her letter to the judge ahead of sentencing, Pettway wrote, "I was a very sick and selfish person who felt the urge to fill that empty void inside me." There it was. 25 years of lies, of a stolen identity, of 2 parents' demolished world, reduced to a void. A need. A want so absolute it swallowed everything in its path. Carlina herself did not speak publicly in condemnation of Pettway. This is the detail that makes the case so psychologically complex, so genuinely human that it refuses to fit neatly into any framework of villain and victim. "I was brought up well," Carlina said in her only in-depth interview. "I didn't get mistreated." She acknowledged that Pettway had, on one occasion, hit her with a shoe hard enough to leave an imprint on her face. But she also said this, "I don't have no anger about it. I still have love for her." She agreed to testify on Pettway's behalf at trial. Pettway's own son, Trayvon, who had grown up as Carlina's half-brother, wrote a letter to the judge asking for leniency. "I feel sad that my mother is not her mother," he wrote, "but I don't want anyone to take away my mother from me either." The complexity of that sentence could fill a semester of graduate psychology. On July 30, 2012, Pettway stood before Judge P. Kevin Castell in Manhattan Federal Court. She was 50 years old. The defense had argued for leniency, pointing to her history of miscarriages, her stillbirths, her abusive upbringing, the psychological pain that had driven her to this. The judge heard all of it. He acknowledged it, and then he named what it was. "This was not a crime of greed," he said. "This was not a crime of vengeance. It was an act of selfishness. A crime of selfishness. A crime that inflicted a parent's worst nightmare on a couple." He sentenced her to 12 years in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release. Joy White, in court that day, said she had cried for days after her child was kidnapped. That for 23 years, she had wondered if her daughter was being fed, washed, and loved. Carl Tyson could barely hold it together. Outside the courthouse, He turned to the cameras and said what a father who has had 23 years taken from him would say. I wasn't able to take my daughter to school, take my daughter to daycare, watch my daughter get on the bus, have birthday parties with my daughter. His voice carried every single one of those years. For 23 years, and you had me suffering. You took something away from me. You hurt me so bad. Manhattan U.S. Attorney Preet Bharara spoke after the sentencing. He said, exactly 25 years ago, and Pettway snatched an ailing newborn from a hospital. And with that kidnapping, she shattered 3 lives. The life of the child who would not know her parents, and the lives of her parents who were left to wonder what had become of their baby. And Pettway was sent to the Federal Correctional Institution in Aliceville, Alabama. She was released on April 14, 2021. The reunion between Carlina and her biological family was joyful. And then, with the relentlessness of reality, it became complicated. Carlina's attorney, shortly after the reunion, advised her to ask her birth parents about the cash settlement from the hospital lawsuit. Joy and Carl had received $750,000 in 1993, but much of it had been spent over the years. There was no one to blame for that. There was just time and grief and survival. The trust fund that had been established could only be accessed if Carlina had been found before the age of 21. She was found at 23. There was a falling out. Carlina became estranged from her biological parents for a period. She later publicly described it as just a misunderstanding. And within a few months, she had individually reconnected with both Joy and Carl, working through the newness and strangeness of a relationship that had been robbed of its foundation by another person's need. She has lived largely privately since then. She still sometimes goes by Nettie, the name, and gave her, a testament to the unresolvable dual nature of her identity. She told a reporter in 2014 that she had forgiven in Pettway and was in contact with her. That, too, is a detail that defies easy categorization. What is left when you try to take in the full shape of this story? A 16-year-old mother who put bows in her daughter's hair for 19 days and then had to live the next 23 years with the shape of that loss pressed against every single morning. A father who kept his daughter alive in the present tense, always, because past tense would have meant surrender. A grandmother who made a dinner on a Sunday in January 2011 and watched children run around the room and felt something she had waited 2 decades to feel again. A woman who became a mother out of desperation and crime, who raised someone else's child with enough love that the child would forgive her, and who still committed one of the most intimate violations one person can commit against another. And Carlina herself. Carlina, who spent her whole life feeling like a question, who felt different, always, without knowing why, who looked at a photo on a missing children's website and recognized herself, who did not wait for someone else to solve it, who picked up the phone and called, who solved her own case, who became, as the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children confirmed, the first kidnapping victim in the center's history to personally lead the efforts that brought herself home. The room where Joy White sat in the pediatric ward of Harlem Hospital on the night of August 4, 1987 still exists somewhere in the architecture of that building. The bassinet has long since been replaced. The ward has changed. But that room holds the weight of what happened in it. The weight of a young mother being told to go home and rest, of trusting a stranger in a green smock, of returning in the morning to find her daughter gone. Joy White cried for days after that morning. She used her daughter's name as her email address for 17 years. She was asked in court what she had wondered in all those years of not knowing, and she said she had wondered if her daughter was being fed, washed, and loved. She was. In the way a child stolen from her parents and renamed can be loved. She was. But Joy White deserved to be the one who fed her, who washed her, who put bows in her hair past the 19th day. She deserved all of it. And it was taken from her by a woman who simply wanted what she wanted and could not find another way. Sometimes the most shattering crimes don't happen in alleyways or dark parking lots. Sometimes they happen in hospitals, in the places we run to for safety, in the moments when we are most vulnerable, when we are sick or afraid, when we hand our most precious thing to someone else and trust that the world will hold it carefully. Sometimes the person who offers to comfort you is the very person you should fear. And sometimes the only person who can unlock the mystery of a stolen life is the person living it, quietly, with a birthmark on her arm, staring at a photograph on a computer screen and feeling, for the first time, Like the question finally has an answer. Carlina White found herself. In every sense of the phrase. And that is a kind of courage the world doesn't have a good enough word for. If this story moved you, and if you stayed with us all the way to the end, please take a moment right now to like this video, leave a comment below telling us which part of this story hit you hardest, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and share this with someone who deserves to hear it. Stories like Carlina's deserve to be known. They deserve to echo. Every share keeps that echo going. We'll see you in the next one.